We're very happy today to have Dave Lindorff, who is an investigative reporter, filmmaker, and a columnist for CounterPunch, and who has been a contributor to tarbill.org, The Nation, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, and Salon.com. Lindorff graduated from Wesleyan University, received an MS in journalism from the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, has been a two-time Fulbright Scholar, and also was a Knight Baggot Fellow in Economics and Business Journalism at Columbia University. He's been a winner of the 𝐓𝐡𝐞𝐨𝐝, which is basically, I guess, after I.S. Stone, for outstanding independent journalism. He's also the founding editor of the collectively run journalism news site This Can't Be Happening, with several other journalists, including Ron Rindenauer of Me Live fame. And he is someone who's run 7 Project Centered Awards for coverage. He basically was labeled a threat to domestic security for a memo that he wrote, and they obtained the memo saying he's a threat from a FOIA filing with the Department of Homeland Security. He's worked as a bureau chief covering LA government for the LA Daily News, and has worked as a producer for PBS station KCET in Los Angeles. So he has many different distinguished awards as a journalist, but we're going to talk to him tonight about one of his 5 books and a movie he was associated with. And this is a book called Spy for No Country, the story of Ted Hall, the teenage atomic spy who may have saved the world. He also did a documentary, A Compassionate Spy, which is co-produced with Mark Mitten. And this was a feature-length documentary film directed by two-time Academy Award winner Steve James about the youngest physicist on the Manhattan Project, 18-year-old Theodore Hall, who we will hear a lot about. Now, we're, of course, going into an area which is hotly debated ever since the case of the Rosenbergs in the early part of the Cold War, and to this day. So we're very interested to have Dave here. Thank you so much for taking the time. Dave, you're on stage.
Thanks a lot, Jim. I would say it's been hotly debated actually ever since the dropping of the Hiroshima the uranium bomb. That's when the debate started. Should this have even been built? But and should it have been kept as a monopoly by the U.S. or shared? And Ted played a very significant role in the fact that the U.S. did not end up with a monopoly on the bomb, because the main thing he did was give the schematics and all the details for how to make the bomb to the Soviet Union as the youngest physicist in the Manhattan Project. He started spying. Well, he got hired at 18 in January 1944 from his junior year in physics at Harvard, when he started there at 16, and he was 17 when he was hired, and he was 18 by the time he got to Los Alamos. And within 6 months of his getting there, he decided he had to share the bomb, because he realized that the U.S. was going to come out of the war with the bomb by itself. And he thought that would be a catastrophe for the world. So that's the thumbnail sketch of what he did. And I'll go into why he wound up being so important compared to the other spies who were in the project, which were about 8 people, none of whom knew about each other. Because of the way the Soviets set up their spying system. They had them all siloed with their own couriers, so that if one ever got caught, supposedly the others wouldn't get caught. So it's really an amazing story, and it's also one that excuse me. What struck me about it when I started it was how many coincidences had to happen in order for Ted to have been able to be a spy at 18. I'll tell you a few of them. They're mind blowing, because it's so unlikely that, had I done this as a work of fiction, as a spy story, I would have had to write it like some Latin American novelist like Garcia Marquez, uh, and use the mystical literary method. So, um, for example, uh, Ted, when he was 14, had graduated from the Townsend Harris School, which was a you know, uh, school for geniuses, and had a lot of people that graduated who became Nobel Prize winners. And he graduated at 14 from that. And his brother suggested that he should apply to Columbia. His older brother, who had been, I'm jumping ahead, his older brother, 11 years older, who became an aeronautical engineer and was also brilliant, had told the parents, to Russian immigrants, Jewish Russian immigrants, that their young son was super brilliant and couldn't just plain go to school because he'd be bored to tears and his mental abilities would be wasted. And so he said, I'm going to take charge of his education. And they said, okay. So he was learning, higher math. He was learning history. He was getting schooled by his older brother. So his brother said, you should apply to Columbia. And he took the entrance exam and supposedly got the highest score that Columbia had seen from any applicant. And they said they would admit him. So he went in, his mother went in with him, and a admissions officer convinced her that for maturity reasons, he thought he would do better taking a year to travel or whatever, and just mature before he came to Columbia. If he had gone to Columbia, he probably would have done well. Maybe he would have crashed. But if he had done well, even, he would have never wound up at Los Alamos, because when Oppenheimer needed more people towards the end of the war, when they were rushing. And John Van Vleck, who was this very famous astrophysicist, who has a big observatory named after him, who they would recommend. It asked them for 4 recommendations of graduate students, and Van Vleck picked 2 who were graduate students, and he picked 2 who were 18. One was Ted, who was the youngest, and as I said, a junior. Well, at the time he was, I guess, a sophomore. And then Roy Glauber, who was also 18, but a few months older, who became a Nobel Prize winner and a professor at Harvard. And those 4 guys rode a train in late January 1944 out to Los Alamos and were assigned jobs. Ted would never have gotten that job if he'd gone to Columbia, because they didn't search for them at Columbia, second tier Ivy League school. so, um, so that's just one example. Here's another one. When they got to Los Alamos, they were assigned to different places, and Ted got assigned to the theoretical. They had a theoretical unit at Los Alamos that was working on things like calculating the critical mass of U-235, which they didn't know yet. They were guessing everywhere from 100 kilogram, 100 pounds to 15 pounds, and really didn't know. And then the other one was the P group, which was the experimental group, and that was what was doing the actual physical construction of the bomb. How do you do it? It was almost more of an engineering thing. And so Ted got put in the theoretical division and was put to work calculating the critical mass of uranium. And Glauber was put in the P group, which was mainly working on the plutonium bomb, which that was super secret because plutonium was discovered during the war by U.S. scientists. And what they learned as they studied it was that, like 235, plutonium-239 was a fissionable element that could make chain reaction and be used to make a bomb. But it had a flaw for them, which was that uranium had the most common isotope was 238, which was not fissionable. And the small amount, like I think 0.07%, 0.072% of it was 235, and they had to figure out how to get enough of that out to make a bomb. The plutonium was the opposite problem. It had the largest isotope was fissionable, but it had a small percentage, tiny percentage of P240, which was 1,000 times more fissionable than the main isotope. And what that meant was that if they made a subcritical mass of plutonium and crushed two pieces of it together the way they were going to do the uranium bomb, fairly simply in a cannon kind of setup, blasting one piece at the other at 1,000 feet per second or something, that the plutonium bomb would melt before the two halves met, and would therefore splatter and not get the sufficient amount together at the same time to make that huge bomb. Instead, it would be a tiny explosion that might blow up a building, called a fizzle. And so they puzzled over how to do that, and then somebody came up with the idea of an implosion system where they would take a whole bunch of pieces that fit together perfectly and blast them with chemical explosions all the way around that had to go off within nanoseconds of each other so that it all came together in a balanced way, and that would blow up. And that was Ted's job, was to make that implosion system work. So he was testing it over and over and over, and getting irradiated in the way. They weren't doing it with, by the way, plutonium, because that would have been a disaster when they finally got to work. They were doing it with a substitute for plutonium that would make a neutron burst that they could measure. So anyway, Ted was put on the wrong test to know anything about the plutonium bomb. He was the wrong group, and he was doing uranium. So shortly after that, he was in his room with Glauber, who had the room next to him in a dormitory, and they were talking, and Glauber was complaining and saying he was really bored doing the experiments. He was more of a theoretical guy, and he said, I wish I were doing the theoretical work. And Ted said, well, that's all right if you want to swap, if it's okay with the with the senior people. I don't care which one I work on. And so they went, and Glauber asked and said Ted didn't care, and they switched. And so that worked out. And as a result, Ted was working on the plutonium bomb. Reason that's important is that the Russians would not have had a problem figuring out the uranium bomb in their project because it was so simple. The only problem they would have was something that Ted wouldn't have learned at Los Alamos, which was how to separate out the 235 most efficiently. That was being done at Columbia and at Oak Ridge and at Hanford, which were other parts of the Manhattan Project. So because Ted got on the plutonium bomb, when the time came for him to become a spy and he went to them, they were ecstatic because they and that's another part of the story which I have to get to. So at that point, we have Ted working on the bomb, and the war is going badly for the Germans by the fall of 1944. And, the Germans were getting bombed day and night from the US and British heavy bombers. They were hitting all the infrastructure. And, the senior scientists and Ted himself were thinking, well, the Germans are not going to get this bomb. There's no way they can. They knew how hard they were having to work with unlimited resources, and the Germans were strapped. They didn't have anything at this point, and so they were. Some of them were petitioning Roosevelt and later Truman after April 1945, when Roosevelt had died. They were petitioning Truman to say, don't use the bomb on a non-nuclear nation. And some were arguing, don't make it. Why do we need it? Let's just ban it. We don't need it to end the war. And Ted knew that these things weren't going anywhere. Niels Bohr tried to talk to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt had the FBI tail him to make sure that he wouldn't end up giving something to the Russians. And Joseph Rotblat, Polish and English dual citizen, quit in November of 44 because on principle, he said, we shouldn't be building this, and I don't want to be part of it anymore because it's not targeting the Germans. So Ted, seeing that none of this was going to be effective and really wanting to make sure that the bomb did not belong to one country after the war, decided he had to act on his own. He had to give it to somebody that could stop the US from using the bomb. And in discussions with his roommate, who later became his spy courier, Saville Sachs, his Harvard roommate, said, well, it has to be the Russians that you give it to, because the French, the Germans, the British, they're not going to stop the US. Even if they could, they wouldn't want it to. But the Russians could. And, Ted agreed. He thought the same way. So he decided he had to become a spy. And then that's what a lot of the book is about how they did that. It's just amazing. Think about it. Spies don't advertise themselves. They don't do wanted ads, help wanted spy or spy courier, whatever. They hide themselves and are very difficult to find, even for the people that are trained to hunt for them. And here you got two guys, 18 and 19 years old, who are trying to find them so they can volunteer. Now, an obvious place would be to go to the Soviet consulate in New York, where Ted had grown up and where Savvy had grown up too, and go there and try to volunteer in the consulate. But as Savvy Sachs pointed out, that Ted couldn't do that because they had his picture from his badge and all of that at Los Alamos. And he said, the FBI is going to be watching the consulate all the time to see who goes in and out. And your picture, when you go in, they're going to look for your picture and they're going to find it. and so you'll be caught. But they don't know me. I'm not associated with Los Alamos. I could go in and try to talk to somebody. It wasn't that easy for him to do, actually, but that was their idea. So they settled on a strategy, and the strategy was initially to start. I back up. Ted had a 19th birthday coming up in October, and they were starting to let people finally have a break to see family because things were starting to go well with getting the bombs done. And so Ted had asked for permission for a 2-week leave to go back and see his family, who he hadn't seen since he left for Los Alamos, and for his 19th birthday. And it was granted. So he traveled to New York and arranged to meet his roommate who was at Harvard in New York. And so when they met, the strategy they picked was that Savi would go to the Art Kino, which was a propaganda operation of the Soviet Union for promoting their war films in the US to encourage people to support them with aid, um, and political support in the US. And then Ted was decided to go to Amtorg, which was the Soviet Union's trading company in the garment district. And it was doing two things. It was selling confiscated goods, jewelry, silver samovars, and what have you, from wealthy people that had their wealth expropriated in order to raise hard currency to buy war material. And then they were also buying war material from the U.S. that they either had to get through Lend-Lease or buy it outright. And so that was what that operation was. Ted decided he would go there, figuring that these business types there would talk to him, and they would know people in the consulate or wherever, and somebody would get it if he told them what he had to offer, they would probably help him. So he didn't really think that it would be a nest of spies, but it actually, I would talk to a guy who wrote a history of Klaus Fuchs, who said that the Amtorg was a nest of spies, not only of Soviet spies, but doubling as business people and using it as cover, but also FBI people, sources in there. So he was lucky he didn't go to one of those. But so Ted went in and he went up the freight elevator, and he went onto an Amtorg floor, and he saw a guy stacking boxes. And so he went over to him, and the guy said, "What do you want?" And he had a American accent. And so Ted just told him. He said, he said, "I'm a physicist." This is a guy who didn't have any facial hair and had acne and looked like a high school kid. He said, "I'm a physicist at a top secret bomb project in New Mexico, or out west, I think he said. And I need to tell someone in the Soviet government about it because they don't know about it. They're making a super weapon." And the guy got very nervous, Ted said, and he said, "Well, there'd be nobody here that would be able to know what to do with that. That's not what we do." And Ted said, "But they really need to know." He pressed him, and the guy said, "Well, look, what I can give you an address for a emigre Russian journalist who is writing about the war and stuff for U.S. magazine. So, so he said, I can give you this journalist's name. He knows everybody Russian in New York City. And he would know probably better than anybody, somebody that could get this to the right place for you. And so Ted left with that. And he was pretty discouraged because, you know, he's getting a journalist instead of a spy. And he was, you know, it was one step away from where he wanted to be. He met up with Savvy, who had gone to 𝐓𝐡𝐞𝐞. He had had the same problem. He went in and he managed to get to see the director of 𝐓𝐡𝐞𝐞, and which was over somewhere near Columbus Circle. And he told him that, you know, he needed to see somebody to tell them about a friend of his. This is even more remote, who knew about a secret weapon being built by the US and the Russians. He wanted to tell the Russians about it. And the guy said, well, I can't help you with that, you know, but, you know, I know this journalist who is a Russian emigre who could maybe, he knows all these people, the Russians, and he might know somebody that it should go to. So he gave him this address. So Savvy goes out, they come together, and when they realized they'd both gotten the same name, they suddenly realized, well, maybe this really is something. So they got in touch with him. So his name was Sergei Kornikov. And so he was actually a Tsarist cavalry officer and a white Russian in the Civil War, but he had fled the new Soviet state because of that, and had come to America, and where he was accepted because he'd been a white Russian. And then later he became very supportive of the Soviet Union, and ended up being not only a spy, but he was a recruiter for spies for the NKVD in the US, which was one of the precursors of the KGB. So, so he was actually the right person. They found on the first hit, you know, they got the right one. And so he said to Ted, he was very skeptical, obviously, and he didn't tell him that he was with the NKVD or that he was a recruiter. He just said, well, I can try to help you, but let me ask you, why would you want to be a traitor to your country? And Ted said, well, I'm not being a traitor. It's that I don't think that the United States should be able to have the bomb by itself. It'll be very dangerous. And I think that the Soviet Union needs to have it also. Otherwise, it'll get used. And, you know, he said that. And the guy said, well, yeah, but, you know, you're risking your life doing this. And he said, well, I think it's important. And he convinced him. And he said, well, how do I know that you're like actually what you say you are? And he said, well, I can tell you that who was at this project, and he named like 20 incredible top figures from Niels Bohr to you know, Fermi to geez, I mean, he said, I can't remember all the names he put on the list off the top of my head, but they were all these top people, Szilard, and well, it'll come to me. There's a lot of them. There's like 20 of these guys he put on a list. And when Gorchakov looked at it, he said he knew who these people were because his father had been a scientist. And so he knew this was like the real deal. And then Ted also drew him a picture of the implosion system of the bomb and wrote what it was. And he said, give this to any physicist in the Soviet Union, and they will tell you that this is a serious bomb. And it was just a hand-drawn, you know, mock-up of the way the plutonium bomb was going to work. And so that was sent to by pouch to Lubyanka, the head of the spy system, and which was a slow process because it went over, those went overland up through the new Alaskan highway where they were shipping planes or having planes hop uh, at fueling stations all the way to the Bering Strait so that they could fly them over into Russia and either keep hopping them over to the front line or put them on trains on the Trans-Siberian Railway to get them to the Western Front against the Nazis. And those would also go with a pouch. And so the pouch took a while to get there. And in the meantime, Ted had 2 days left before he had to go. So the 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 head of the NKVD in the consulate decided to do something pretty daring, given that Beria was the head of the whole spy operation in the Soviet Union, and he didn't like to have people screw up. And so what he did was he made the decision that we're going to accept Ted Hall and his roommate as spies because Ted's going to be gone and incommunicado after he leaves. That it was totally shut down at Los Alamos. You couldn't use the phones because they were being tapped in Santa Fe and Albuquerque, and you couldn't. The one phone that was usable on Los Alamos was, no way you could talk on that. And the mail was all being monitored both ways. So they had to make a decision. Do we trust him or not? And they decided they would. And so in their memo to Lubyanka, they said, we have this volunteer who's walked in um, from the factory, they called it, because they did know about it. Uh, and he's offering to spy for us and to tell us about the plutonium bomb. And so we've decided to take him because he's leaving now, and we will only be able to get in touch with him through his roommate, who we're taking on as the courier. They did find out that Savvy's mother was an American communist, a Russian immigrant woman, and that gave them a lot of confidence that Savvy at least was legit. Um, so they made that big step and eventually got word back that they should use him. But at any rate, that's when Ted went to the train to go back. His parents or his father and his stepmother came with him to say goodbye. And as he's standing there waiting for them to say that they're boarding the train, he noticed Kornikov sitting across the Penn Station. This is the old Penn Station, big gallery and everything, not like the one they have today. And they saw this. He saw this older guy that he recognized as Kornikov sitting there who signaled to him. So he goes, "Oh my God, what is this?" So he walks over. He says he left his parents there looking at him, walking over to this strange old guy. And he goes to him, and Kornikov says, "You're in. They've taken you on as an agent, as a spy." And so Ted said it's great, and he said that Savvy would be getting in touch with him and meeting him. And so Ted went back, and I don't know what he said to his. I guess he didn't go back. He didn't go back to his parents. He went because they called for the train, so he was happy that he didn't have to go and explain that. And as he's walking away, Kornikov stood up and saluted him. Uh, and that, was kind of weird. But he was so excited that he did that. And he was, wanted to show him, I guess, that he was proud of him for having the courage to do it. So anyway, he headed back on the train with being a spy. Now, when he got there, something happened that was really interesting. He was a few weeks into the job after he had swapped with Glauber. He and Glauber were sitting in his room talking, and Glauber said, this was late December, Glauber said, and this is in Soviet spy cables that got translated later. Glauber said, uh, they were saying, that it's really terrible that this bomb is being built without the Soviets knowing, because here the Soviets were doing most of the fighting and dying against the Nazis, and now we're doing something secret from them. And they both agreed with that. And Glauber said, "Well, I for one, if I had a chance to tell them, I would." And Ted said, "Well, I already did that. And if you would like to do it, I can put you in touch with somebody," which was pretty stupid, but he did it. He thought maybe I can recruit him if he thinks that way. And so he did that, and Glauber totally freaked out. And he left. He asked to be moved to a different apartment. He stayed away from Ted after that on Los Alamos site. And when the NKVD got word of this, error on Ted's part, they were really freaked out. And Ted said, "Don't worry, Glauber will not rat on me to anybody. We're friends. I trust him. He thinks like I do, but he doesn't have the courage of his convictions to act on it. But he's not going to report me." And that turned out to be the case. He never did report it to security at Los Alamos. And on the occasions when the FBI came to him later, after they found out about Ted in 1950, he was questioned in 1951, and he was questioned later in 1963, 65. And both times he lied to the FBI and said that he wasn't even friends with Ted. Um, he knew him, but he never would have thought he would be a spy. But they weren't close. And they actually were roommates at Harvard. So his lies were shaky. And if they had done their homework, they could have gotten him for lying to the FBI. But it was a case of friendship trumping, his own safety, which is pretty impressive. So this was the big mystery that nobody knew, and it was my big breakthrough in this book, because I got there was a book about Ted that was published in 1997. Ted was discovered publicly in 1995 when the NSA released some of the first um, Soviet spy cables from the war that were sent in code, a very complicated code they used, that was sent from the consulates where there were NKVD offices. I think there was one in San Francisco and one in one of the cities in Texas, and one in New York City, which was the main office. And they would send these cables to Lubyanka and get cables back from Lubyanka. And it took a long time to decode them. And it was a very complicated system with a book of pages and a double encryption. And they need to throw away the page that you used, and that one would be thrown away in the other places. And then you have to use another page somewhere. And they didn't go sequentially. So it was pretty good code. And it took actually until the late 60s before they decrypted all of them, all of the pages that they were recording. They knew it was code. It was going on Western Union cables because the Soviets were so confident it would never be caught. But that was the Venona documents, that Venona project of the Signal Intelligence Service, which was the precursor of the NSA. That was doing this project, and one of the first cables that they managed to decrypt was Ted's list of the scientists who were at the project, and one of the other early ones that was translated, and actually it was 1949. late 49 when they cracked it. It was the top of a message saying that a volunteer spy has come to us who's working at the New Mexico bomb making site, um, who is named Theodore, Theodor, Koll, the son of a Soviet Jewish furrier, immigrant furrier. And that was the giveaway because his father was a furrier. And that, so that made the Koll thing understandable. And Theodore obviously is Ted. And they spelled Sachs's name Sachs when it was Sax, but they got it. And so they had those two guys in late 1949 that they told to Hoover in April of 1949 that the NSA was very, very nervous about releasing this information because they didn't trust even the FBI. They didn't. Truman didn't find out about it for almost a year after they knew it. They didn't trust anybody because what they didn't want was for the Soviets to know that they had broken the code, right? Because there was a lot more they could get as they were learning how to break it. So at that point, they did feel they had to tell Hoover. And so Hoover immediately started a all bureau investigation to find out where the hell Ted was. Where did he go after the shutdown of the Los Alamos operation, which was within 6 months closed down and replaced by the Atomic Energy Commission, which was based in, Livermore Labs and stuff, not at Los Alamos. So Ted had been stuck there because he had been drafted during the war and was in uniform, and so he couldn't leave the special SED, Special Engineering District that was headed by Leslie Groves, the general in charge of the Manhattan Project. He had to stay there until he was decommissioned, which happened 6 months after the war. And then he was able to go to Chicago, University of Chicago, to get his PhD, which was where he was. Interesting coincidence. When he got there, Edward Teller was there working on the hydrogen bomb, and mostly he wasn't there, and so he let Ted use his office, right? As he had a desk in Teller's office. However, he wasn't doing spying at that point because, first of all, he didn't really want to be involved in the hydrogen bomb, he said. And second of all, he'd lost his security clearance because he had a problem where his brother, and this is the one who had educated him, had spent the war in England repairing bombers that had been damaged by shrapnel and cannon fire and anti-aircraft fire and stuff, and had limped back to the UK where he would fix them so that they could turn around and fly back. And he was really good at that and got a Legion of Merit award for the way he figured out how to do it without taking the fuselage apart. So it was much faster. At any rate, he got married there to an English woman, and she wrote a letter to Ted, who she never had met, but she just wanted to make friends because she was now his sister-in-law. And she wrote him a letter, and it said, I understand you're working on something that goes up and goes boom. Could we get some of them for Guy Fawkes Day? And that got picked up by the censors, and they thought that Ted had spilled the beans to his brother, and so the FBI actually went to or had somebody in England to question him, and she explained. Well, I didn't know. He explained he'd never said anything neither of the brothers had communicated about Los Alamos, which was true. And he said, I I thought he was building rockets. And um, they finally accepted that, but they were still disturbed that that incident happened and were suspicious of Ted, also because he was getting a lot of lefty magazines in his mail, which were allowed, but made them a little suspicious. So they took away his security clearance at the end of the war. They used him to do the work that Oppenheimer said had been critical to the success of the plutonium bomb. But they took it away at the end of the war. And so he couldn't do any kind of national security kind of stuff in the physics department. And and he actually changed his major to biophysics so that he wouldn't be like suspected anymore. And so that's what he got his PhD in. So what happened with Ed was when he got back, he was put on a top secret engine lab at Wright-Patterson Air Base in Dayton, where he was working on rocket motors because he knew all about the V2. He had been involved in Operation Paperclip after the war to try to pick up as many rocket scientists as he could, and he learned all about the V2 in the process. And so he was put on designing in the 50s motors for the Atlas, the Titan, the Thor missile, IRBM, and then he invented the concept for how to make a large ICBM solid fuel missile, and that was the Minuteman. He solved the two biggest problems of that missile. One was you had to have a way to turn it off fast, and because otherwise it would overshoot the target. And with liquid fuels, you have valves, you can shut off the fuel. But with the solid fuel rockets are a kind of a clay-like fuel that has the oxidizer in it too, and is stuck on the outside of the tubes of the missile, and it's its own insulation to prevent the burn through of the metal casing of the rocket, like what happened to the Challenger. And they didn't have a way to shut it down, and they didn't have a way to keep it from burning through unevenly. He solved both problems. One was he solved the shutdown thing by installing carbon dioxide gas pipes that would spray in a shutdown by cutting it all off. And then he also put figured out how to make a star shape inside the tube of the fuel, which allowed it to burn in a predictable way through the so that it would not get all in one place too fast. And that solved it, so they could shut it off and when they wanted to, and not have a burn through. So he was made director of the Minuteman project. And what I learned, because I asked for his FBI file because I knew that that had to be important. He didn't even get mentioned in the bombshell, other than that was his brother. But I I've got the file after they told me they didn't have it, because I said, look, this guy was in the Air Force. He was building Minuteman missiles, or actually at that time the Atlas motor. He had to have a top security clearance. The FBI would have had to investigate him for him to get that. And so you have to have something on him. And then they said, oh, we found it, and they gave me 103 pages on him. And it turned out that in that file were a couple of letters from Hoover to the head of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, which was, the Air Force was a new military wing, and every military wing has an OSI. And the guy who was put in charge of it was recommended to the Air Force by Air Force and their Secretary of the Air Force by J. Edgar Hoover, and that was this guy named Joseph Carroll, who was made a general and put in charge of OSI. Carroll had been Hoover's chief lieutenant, and his mentee, I think would be fair to say. He was one of his favorite guys. He helped him capture a really nasty mobster, and that's what got his attention on Carroll. So he really liked Carroll, and he wrote a letter to Carroll, which was less than formal. He said, dear Joseph, I am writing to inform you that that your Major Nathaniel Hall is working in a top secret missile engine development lab, and is the brother of a known atomic spy. And we're letting you know because we're investigating the spy, and we would like to urgently interview Ed Hall. And there's not a reply to that letter in the file that I was given, although there are some pages that weren't given to me, so there might be one. They could be using the argument that that was privileged information because it was coming from someone else than Hoover, but it's not a really good one because he's long dead. And it's been like he died in the 60s, and this whole story is very old. So I have an appeal in for that. But what I do have is a February 18th letter that says, it says, General Carroll, and this one's not friendly. It says, I'm writing in response to my January 6th letter informing you that that Major Hall is the brother of an atomic spy, and to your response on February 18th. So I know there was another letter, or no, I'm sorry, January 17th, your reply of January 17th. And this letter is from, wait, I got to get these dates right in my head. It was March, I'm sorry, okay. It was March 27th when Hoover writes back, and he refers to the February 18th letter and the January 6th letter, and says, we have questioned Ted Hall and now urgently need to talk with Ed Hall. And I understand that you said, okay, I understand that you said in your February 18th letter that you're going to handle the inquiry into Ed Hall's loyalty, but we urgently need to talk with him because we've just interviewed Ted. So that's where it stood. And the next thing that is in the file is that 3 months later, not urgently, 3 months later, two agents of the FBI from the Cincinnati office are allowed to interview Ted Hall, but with an OSI guy sitting in on it because he's only supposed to talk to Ed about what he knows about his brother, not anything about himself. So there was a restriction put on it. And obviously, he was still working in the lab because they had to go and talk to him at Wright-Patterson, where he was working on the rocket motors. And so Ed denied knowing anything about his brother's being a spy. He also said that the last time he had seen his brother was a year before. He claimed he wasn't very close to his brother since he left for the war because Ted was obviously out in Los Alamos. He was in the UK, and all they had was letters, which they only did a few. And he backed away from his brother as saying, I don't really know that much about him anymore. He said we were very close when we were young, but not since the war or during the war. And all of that was a lie. They were very close. And also, I learned from Ted's widow that after Ted was picked up on March 16th of 1951 by two agents and brought to the FBI office in Chicago, and 𝐓𝐶 was picked up too, unknown to Ted, on the same day and brought there separately, so they didn't know each other were there. And both were questioned for a couple hours, grilled for a couple hours. And both of them, having figured this could happen, had talked about what they would do. And Ted said he was going to deny everything. And 𝐓𝐶 said he would deny everything, but he would also say that he had a really bad memory. And he did that. I mean, ridiculously. He couldn't remember when he got married. He couldn't remember. He knew he got married, but he couldn't remember the date of his getting married. He couldn't remember the birth date of his son. And he kept apologizing and saying, I'm sorry, I really have a bad memory. And they were very frustrated. You could tell the FBI in their write-up about it that he claimed, that he had a bad memory, but there wasn't much they could do about it. And 12 days after that day, the Air Force promoted Ed to lieutenant colonel, which was a real thumb in Hoover's eye, I'm sure, because they were saying, and they promoted him to director of the engine lab. So they were just saying, this guy is good. And clearly, I don't have the letter, but I assure you that Hoover was told he couldn't arrest Ted. Because think of it, this was 1951. It was the start of McCarthy's rise, and his claim that the army was infested with 300, I think it was, communists. And here was Ted. And here was Ed, who I'm sure Hoover was convinced was a spy too. And he found out about these guys and started investigating them before he arrested the Rosenbergs, right? He thought he had a better case than the Rosenbergs case because he had an actual atomic spy who'd been working on the bomb, and he had a brother who was working on the other most top secret thing that the U.S. had going, which was ICBM development. So, I'm sure he was like really, having wet dreams about this. But He wasn't allowed to do a thing. And the amazing thing is, Hoover was a veteran leaker for his own, advancement and power, but there never a word of this got to the HUAC or to the news media, nothing until 1975 when the Soviet cable was released. Ted was living in England, and the Venona cable named him as an atomic spy. It's in 1995. So, so the reason for sure that Ted wasn't prosecuted was because arresting his brother would have meant that the Air Force would have lost their top missile scientist.
Wow.
This was when he was, before he even had started the design of the Minuteman, and that was his most important contribution. And he was later, before he died, he was inducted into the Air Force Aerospace Hall of Fame in Colorado. There's a big plaque for him as a pioneer in aerospace. Um, so the other thing, the one other thing I want to say now, and this is the most important thing in the book, was the importance of Ted's having done what he did, because there were two people that gave the plutonium bomb plans to the Soviets. One was Klaus Fuchs, who gave a lot more information on it, and also on the uranium bomb. He was the master spy. Um, and he but of course, Ted didn't know that. They didn't know each other were spies, um, even though Ted worked as his assistant after the war when they had a sort of a pop-up university for the guys that were stuck in Los Alamos after the war. And Fuchs was teaching a class in some stuff related to hydrogen. And Ted was supposed to copy his notes and give it to the students to take home with them off of the blackboard. He would copy it all down so they would have it. So at any rate, the timing of Ted becoming a spy was the key, because when he offered himself as a spy, the Soviets were frantic because they had lost touch with Fuchs. Fuchs had left had been brought with the British contingent to come help the Manhattan Project to go faster. They brought the British tube alloys people over to the US to join the Manhattan Project, and they brought Fuchs, who was an interesting character because he was a known communist in East Germany and a brilliant young physicist who was brought over, who went over, escaped the Nazis pursuing him after the Reichstag fire in 1936. He managed to get to England and only got in, even though MI6 knew he was a communist because one of their agents had said he was a hothead communist. And they let him in because his father was a famous Quaker minister who had been in England and made friends, and the Quaker community got him in by coming to his assistance and saying that he could stay with them and stuff like that. A well-known Quaker businessman. And so Fuchs got in and immediately was put in a physics program in Bristol. And when they started the tube alloy project for making an atomic bomb, which started actually before the Manhattan Project, Fuchs immediately went to the Soviet consulate and offered to spy. And so he was spying already. And, the Russians, of course, thought this was great. And then they started wondering about him because then he was brought over to the US. And they got a little suspicious, like, why was this guy who was a known communist being allowed into the US to work on the bomb project, unless he had maybe turned? And then he gave them these then he was supposed to be sent to Los Alamos, which he did go to, but he missed his connection with his his courier, which is this guy, Harry Gold. And Harry was late to get to the meeting that they planned in Philadelphia, um, or New York, I'm sorry. Harry Gold was in Philadelphia. He missed his appointment in New York with Fuchs, and Fuchs had already left for Los Alamos, but he didn't say that to his neighbors, of course. He said that he was going back to England. And so that's what Gold was told. And so the U.S. was completely flummoxed. The Russian spies system was completely flummoxed. They couldn't get in touch with him. He was stuck in Los Alamos working without access to a phone. He couldn't call them. He couldn't go out and risk a payphone, and he couldn't write a letter. So because the mailboxes in any place he went outside Los Alamos were also being checked. So they had lost Fuchs, and when he finally was found, it was February of 45, and they were going nuts because they didn't have anybody except anybody when this happened in the fall of 44. They didn't have anybody in Los Alamos. And that's when Ted came in the door in October of 44. And so that's why they took him. And what Ted did in giving them the plans for the plutonium bomb was tell them the same thing that Fuchs was telling them, this Baroque design of really complicated engineering that was going to be hard for them to duplicate. Was for real, was not a bum steer to make them focus on it. And so Kurchatov, the Oppenheimer of the Soviet program, got the confidence when he saw this from Ted, and he'd already seen the stuff from Klaus Fuchs. He was able to go to Stalin and do something that's also very, very dangerous. He said to him, we need to stop trying to build the uranium bomb because we're not going to be able to get enough U-235 before the end of the war. And it's urgent that we make a bomb as fast as we can. And we have the plans to make a bomb out of plutonium, which we can get because that is a waste product of nuclear reactors, and we can extract it chemically and get enough to make a bomb. And so Stalin said, okay, we'll drop the uranium bomb until we have the resources to make it, and we'll go full speed with all the resources you need, and all of the scientists should be directed to work on the plutonium bomb. And so what they did, they still hadn't gotten the best stuff from Ted. When right between the time of the Hiroshima bomb and the Nagasaki bomb, Ted had the whole schematics of the bomb in a stack of papers and drawings, which he delivered in Albuquerque to a courier, a professional courier named Lona Cohen, an American of second generation Russian. That was her spy name, and he gave it to her, and that went to the Russians, and they built a virtual carbon copy of the Nagasaki bomb, which is what he gave them. So he enormously sped up the Russians' acquisition of the bomb from the 10 years that they thought it would take, 8 to 10 years, and had it on August 29th, 1949. And here's the other thing. The U.S. began, which nobody knows this that you don't hear this in high school or even college history, that when I didn't know it until I found it out working on the book, that the United States began trying, on Truman's orders, began trying to in the Manhattan Project before the end of the war to start figuring out how to mass produce atomic bombs. And the goal was Truman had asked the strategists in the Pentagon how many atomic bombs it would take to destroy the Soviet Union as an industrial society so that they'd never get the bomb. And they were told it would take 400 atomic bombs hitting 100 Russian cities multiple times in the larger ones, and also all their military bases and their industrial plant and everything. 400 bombs because they wouldn't all reach their targets. And they would need to have 400 planes to deliver them because a lot of them would get shot down. And they needed to do this. They felt like they wanted to do it by something they called A Day, which they thought would be originally they thought they could do this in 1950, but it was taking them so long to get the bombs that by the time the Russians blew off their first plutonium bomb, the U.S. only had 230 bombs, and they didn't have 230 B-26 planes to carry them. I said B-26, B-29s, you're right. Um, and they were repairing ones that they managed to fly back to the U.S. after the war that needed to, and they all needed to have larger bomb bays to drop these bombs, which were quite large. And so they couldn't do it in 1950. They didn't have the 400 bombs. They didn't have anywhere near the number of bombers. They restarted the assembly line for the B-29, and so they aimed instead for. They also started, by the way, building the hydrogen bomb before before the Russians had before they even knew there were spies in the Manhattan Project. They were building the hydrogen bomb, and the Russians were learning about that too. And but they couldn't make one without an atomic bomb. So the big focus was first to get the atomic bomb, so they'd be able to make the hydrogen bomb. And so really, the point I make in the book is that they had a whole series of plans called, they went from like pincer and sizzle and broiler and bushwhacker and ultimately drop shot that was updated after that and called drop shot with more and more targets as they got more and more bombs. They had an operational plan to attack the Soviet Union preemptively with hundreds of bombs and by what they called A Day, which was the date that they thought the Russians would have enough bombs themselves that they couldn't do it without with absolute assurance that there wouldn't be some kind of atomic retaliation. So, so that was the significance of Ted's spying, was that never happened, which is pretty amazing. So I think that covers
Yeah. Wow. You've done a hell of a
everything.
job. Yeah.
And I hope we have time for questions.
We do. And I want to thank you. What a great comprehensive overview of your book. Now, let me start off. Explain the significance in your mind of the Rosenberg case with Ethel Gillian and David Greenglass and Ruth Greenglass. And those of you who want to ask questions, please raise your hands. Go on.
Okay. The thing with the Rosenbergs is that the Rosenbergs, that's been a huge debate. The Rosenbergs were not actually formally charged with being atomic spies, and they weren't convicted of being atomic spies. Their main crime that they were convicted on was the proximity fuse, which was a serious, that was another top secret project like the Manhattan Project and the radiation lab. That was to make it so that the bombs and shells could explode before they hit their target and fragmentation and make it a much more damaging explosion. And that was the Rosenberg's work that they did. They did get some very minor information from Harry from David Greenglass, who was the brother-in-law of Ethel Rosenberg, who had been put in the, um, I think maybe coincidentally, probably coincidentally, had been put into the special engineering district because he had some engineering experience and machinist experience. And so he wound up at Oak Ridge and then got transferred to Los Alamos. And in that capacity, he gave two things to the NKVD through his sister, through his wife, who was a spy too. That's Ethel's sister. Um, he gave her a hand drawing, which was inaccurate, of the plutonium bomb, and like just that a sketch he did from what he knew about it, but he didn't really understand it totally, so it's mistaken. Um, and he gave them a example of one of the. He actually got one of the lenses, they called it. It's kind of a cone-shaped metal thing that would focus the blast of the chemical explosive on one of the tampers in the sphere to compress the plutonium. So those two things he sent back to through his sister to the headquarters in the consulate, and that was his role. So it's an ancillary story to the TED story. The only significance is that of the Rosenbergs, though, for this story is that the Soviets, trying to get as much information as they could as the war was ending and the Manhattan Project was folding up, they had Harry Gold do something that they had avoided all through the war up to that point, which was to visit two people instead of one spy, went on a trip to Los Alamos. And Harry screwed up and ended up getting caught. And he was the courier for Klaus Fuchs. So he went and saw Klaus Fuchs, and he went and saw Greenglass. And so when he screwed up, he got investigated by the FBI, and he denied everything at his house, but they were looking at books in his house, and one that they picked up, a map of Santa Fe, fell out of his book. And they asked him, "What's this? I thought you said you'd never gone out to New Mexico." And he caved. He's confessed. And that's how they went and found out about Klaus Fuchs, and who was already back in England, where he had become the head of the British hydrogen bomb project at that point. And so he got caught by MI5 on the information that the FBI sent him. That's the Rosenberg story. But there is an angle with Ted, and this is also one of those weird coincidences. Ted was working at the time of the Rosenberg trial, not trial. He was actually being questioned during the Rosenberg trial in 51. But in 53, he was working at the Sloan Kettering Cancer Institute on electron microscopy, because he was a biophysicist at that point. And his boss had invited the staff to a party on and what happened to be the night that the Rosenbergs were going to be executed. And the party was up in Upper Westchester. So Ted and Joan got all dressed up. They didn't want to go. They didn't feel like going because of the execution. They were in a really down mood, because Ted felt like the Rosenbergs had done something minuscule compared to what he did. He felt guilty that he should be skating free and they're going to get executed. And he actually told Joan he wanted to contact the FBI and offer to, or the Justice Department, and offer to confess to what he did if they would let the Rosenbergs go. And Joan said, no, you can't do that. They won't. They'll tell you that they'll uh, make a deal like that, but once you confess, they're going to get you, and your daughter will be an orphan, and like those boys. And so Ted didn't do it. Um, so at any rate, they were driving to this party, and they're going up route. I guess it's Route 9 before the interstate through Tarrytown and all of that, and they drove past uh, Sing Sing, where the executions were happening by coincidence. They didn't even realize it was there. They just were driving along, and the sunset was going down, and they were listening to. He said they were listening to uh, a Mahler, his favorite composer, to a I think it's a concerto, and it was the movement called The Departure. And it must have been like QXR playing this. And probably because they were being executed at sunset as in honor of in respect of their being Jews, uh, that they knew that it was sunset, and they knew that it was happening right then. And there was The Departure playing on the car radio. And he said it was just this horrifying thing for them to realize they were being executed as they drove by. Um, so there was that little piece, um, odd coincidence. But they went to the party, uh, and put in a short visit as they could get away with, and then went home. But so that's the Rosenberg angle in
Oh,
this.
thank you, Michael. Michael, unmute. Mike.
Yeah, yeah. I'm on here. Um, I have a couple of questions. I'll try to limit it to one for this one. But when he decided that the best way to stop I guess, well, why did he? The question is, why did he feel at that point? Did he ever talk about why he felt that by telling the Soviets that the bomb would never be used? How did he come to that determination? Remember, that was before the bomb was used. And I
Well,
know
he put it that he was an 18-year-old kid and 19 at the time that uh, when the war ended, but 18 when he decided to be a spy, and 18 when he gave all of his information that was really important. Um, he says that he realizes that he was uh, arrogant and impulsive, but he felt that it would be like what happened with chemical weapons after World War I, that that the awesome horror of the bomb, even more so, if all if it was going to wind up being used, would convince the Russians and the US, if the Russians had the bomb, to get rid of it because it wasn't usable. It was so destructive. It would just you know, if you had two sides that were distrustful, um, and would use it against each other, you can't use it. It's a rational thought, I think, um, but it didn't work out that way. It worked out to be mutual assured destruction, which was not his intention, and he didn't even imagine that that would happen. Um, I mean, it is kind of crazy, actually, when you think about it. But but that's the way it went. And he said, I was an arrogant teenager and confident, maybe overconfident. But he said, I still think that what that arrogant kid did was the right thing, that it did turn out to have prevented its being used, even though we came very, very close a number of times and were saved by the actions of lower ranking people who were willing to put their lives and their careers on the line by not following orders in some cases. Um,
Well, yeah, no, the question was, did he really believe? I mean, I know that most of the scientists, because obviously they thought the Nazis and their attitude towards the Jews, the Holocaust against the Jews, which they knew something about at the time, that it was okay to use it against them. But once the Nazis looked like they were going to be defeated, it wasn't okay to use it after that. But I mean, in other words, the bomb was used. So did he actually believe that by giving the information to the Soviets, that the bomb wouldn't be used during the Second World War?
I don't think that there was a sense that the bomb was going to have to be used on Japan among the scientists when they were making it. It was really all about Germany of getting the bomb and not getting the bomb, and whether they would get it in time to stop the Germans from getting the bomb and using it. And they were, it was premised on the idea that maybe if and people have said this in both the Manhattan Project and the tube alloys project, was that if the Germans were getting the bomb, the way to stop them from using it was by having it and not necessarily using it. I mean, there was the thought among the scientists and the two governments that, if the U.S. had the bomb and could show they had the bomb uh, at the same time the Germans were, that it wouldn't be used. It's a rational idea. I mean, if our leaders were more rational, they would have decided that. But they did feel, and Rotblat felt this, Niels Bohr felt this, a lot of people felt this, that among the scientists, that keeping the Russians out of it and keeping it secret, which they all thought had been successfully done, would make the Russians more paranoid and make them secretly build it. I don't think people conceived of the idea that the US was going to go in and destroy the Soviet Union preemptively. Um, but they would have, they didn't think um, that it would be used against a country that didn't have the bomb. And they didn't think that they didn't think that they would have, uh, a ability to get the Russians to not do it if the U.S. had it. And I think that's probably true, unless the U.S. were to voluntarily say, we're not going to build this thing. But that wasn't happening. That's what Rotblat quit for. He said that they shouldn't build it, and he didn't want to be part of building it. He founded the what was it called? Movement of scientists to oppose nuclear weapons and to call for a ban on the bomb.
And I just want to note, I'll just show this quickly. We're well aware of the debates that occurred at Los Alamos among the scientists themselves. Uh,
Oh
this is
yeah, this was the Szilard petition.
the Passar-Lard petition after Trinity, but we know beforehand there was petitioning to FDR, which basically was sidelined by General Groves. But
Yeah, 70 scientists signed this in just one day or 2 days. And it was supposed to go to Truman, and they gave it to Groves, who said that he would give it to him, but he never did. Not that, Truman would have cared whether he got it or not. He wasn't going to listen to that.
yeah, exactly. No, but anyway, go on, Jim.
Yeah, there was I heard your story a week or so ago, and I was curious if you would, or I think one of the things that I remembered that I think is worth relating is how lucky um, Ted Hall was not to get caught. And one of the stories, or parts of the story I remember, was that involved the FBI getting robbed. And I wonder if you could just relate.
Oh
It
my
was a
God,
very,
yeah,
very
that's so
interesting story.
amazing. That the you know that a couple things happened during that time when Ted was when Ted was investigated and grilled by the FBI, and Savvy Sachs. The day that they were picked up, they had not, up till then, according to the FBI files that I got, they had not been monitoring them. They had been questioning people about them that knew them, and they'd been doing investigations, but they hadn't been monitoring them. And they decided to start monitoring them the day that they also picked them up and brought them into the office and grilled them. And so the agents had gone out to start monitoring them, and one of them who was or one car, that they lived in different parts of Chicago. So one car was following Sachs as he walked to, I don't know what it was he was going to. I think it might have been a school because he was doing some teaching. And he went into the building. And so one of the agents went around to the back of the building in case he was just trying to lose them. And the other agent was sitting in the car, and the door was opened, and as they describe it in the file, a colored man put a gun in his side and was basically gonna steal the car or mug him. And he pushed the gun aside, and then his car radio, they had a car radio with the FBI, which went on. It hissed, and then voice came on, and the guy panicked because he realized it was a cop car, not an FBI car, but a cop car. A unmarked car, and he started to leave, and the agent got out to chase him, and the guy fired a shot at him with his gun and missed, and the other agent came running around the building, and they tried to chase him for a while, but they couldn't get close because of the gun, and they didn't have guns. So they decided to call it off, and they told the other guys, and they all left because they hadn't thought of this as a project that they were doing that would require being armed and protected. So that meant that there was nobody monitoring them at that point. And I have the two reports of the agents who were in that incident in the file. The other thing that happened that day, which is pretty amazing, when they came home, when Ted came home from his being grilled, which must have been really scary, he told Joan right away when he got in the house, he said, we have to gather up anything incriminating in the house, put it in a suitcase, and take it to the Chicago Canal, which is a sewer, and dump it in the canal and lose it. And so they did that. They went around the house, they scooped up every kind of letter and incriminating thing, and leftist literature, lists of people that Joan she was like the membership person for the local branch of the Progressive Party. And so she took that, and they put everything in the suitcase. They went into the car with their daughter, their 2-year-old daughter, and they drove with the suitcase full of stuff to the Chicago Canal and threw it in. Nobody saw them do that. Now, if they had been monitoring them, that would have been destroying evidence when they knew that they were being investigated, and that would have gotten them locked up for a long time. And so they were saved by this crazy thing of being, being mugged by two black guys in Chicago. The other thing that happened that they missed was the next morning, Jones said that, recall this is the 17th of March, a Saturday, a guy came to the door and said he was with the phone company, and he was there to fix their phone. And they were puzzled because Ted was there too, because they knew that they hadn't complained about the phone. It didn't have a problem. So and anyway, while they watched the guy, and he took the receiver apart and everything, and he is working on it. And then he said, it's all fixed, and he left. And right after he left, Ed Hall showed up unannounced and came into the house, and he looked at the phone, and they said, signaled to him not to touch it. And he picked it up and listened to it. And he said, signaled them with his hand, let's go outside. And so they went outside, and he said, your phone's tapped. And because he was an engineer, remember? And they went outside, and Jones said he and Ted went off. Well, first he said, what kind of trouble did you get yourself in this time, Ted? And Ted said, well, I just got interrogated yesterday by the FBI about accusing me of spying at Los Alamos. And Ed said, oh, well, I was just questioned by the Office of Special Investigations about you too. And so now I know that Ted was being questioned, which, about his loyalty. And that was what the OSI said they were going to do. So then when Ed went to answer questions from the FBI on June 12th, and they asked him, when did you last see your brother? And Ted said, a year ago. That was a lie. And they would have had him to rights if they'd been monitoring him that morning. But I think the problem was they probably had to suit up the next morning to go do that job, because it would have been, they'd have to check out their guns. They'd have to get probably bulletproof vests and everything. So this was very early morning and he also missed the phone guy. If he'd seen the phone guy was the FBI. And so, there were multiple ways that Ted could have gotten caught here, and Ed could have gotten in trouble too for lying to the FBI, which is a felony. But none of it happened because of this incident of the mugging, which was totally unexpected.
Right. All right, Alex, go on, Alex.
Yeah, well, one thing we're still unsure about is, the Soviets, they also had an agent, Melita Norwood, in the British, atomic bomb project tube alloys. And she was actually considered a more important agent for them than all of the Cambridge Five. So, which seems like she gave them some very important stuff again. Whether she would have any knowledge of, the implosion device, I don't know. But the questions I wanted to ask is, first, Ted did experience, strong anti-Semitism when he was at Harvard. So I wonder how much that's maybe a motivation or convincing him that, United States is not such a good country. And if that had anything to do with, his decision to spy. And a second,
well, he said that in the movie. We had, Ted was dead he died in 1999. So I didn't get to interview him, obviously, when I worked on my book. But he did do some interviews on video after he had been exposed on BBC, BBC Radio 4, Television 4, jointly with CNN. And we got the full tapes of these interviews. Plus, he also made a video with his wife on the advice of his lawyer after he had been exposed and still thought he might get arrested. The lawyer said, Ted, why don't you do a honest statement of what you did and why for the historical record, and I'll keep it in my safe until both of you are dead. I tried to get that tape, but the lawyer had by that point gotten Alzheimer's, and his junior partner who was running the firm did a huge search of the office and the safe and everything and couldn't find the tape. And then Joan remembered that they had given her a copy of it, which was not a very good one, but we had it put under like a costly, repair so that the sound was better and the images were better. And so we had all those clips, and none of the material that we used had been aired. We just got better stuff that didn't get aired because some of it had. And in it, Ted said that, to your point, that he really he thought that no, I mean, I'm trying to remember what I was trying to say here. You said you wondered why Ted thought what? I know this was germane.
Again, that it would have, given him the idea that, well, the United States is not such a good country.
Oh, yeah. He said when he was deciding whether to be a spy, he said that, and this was like in September, he was thinking that, he thought that after the war, maybe it would be a peaceful world. That was the dream. But that he thought that it was also possible that the U.S. could move into a more, if there was a big recession or depression after the war, like happens a lot, that the U.S. could see a fascist government rise like Germany did, like Weimar did. And in fact, when you look what happened in the 50s with the McCarthy period and HUAC, he wasn't very far off. And he thought that the country could become a fascist state, which it didn't, although now it might be. But he thought that it might happen. And so, it would be a protection against that if there was another country.
Right. An amazing section. Now I remember the question. Yeah, the amazing section in the book is actually Ted's reaction to the Trinity test, which is, again, he describes that, everybody else, all the other scientists are like celebrating or like, ecstatic, but he basically felt sick, and that how horrible this new weapon was. And he's kind of seemed, well, at least again, according to his own account, that he's seems to be, one of the only people to like realize, shit, this is not the great thing that, these other scientists, who I guess are just like, amazed, we did this. And so I think that's an interesting again, that he had like,
Jesus, God.
had such a different reaction to, again,
Yeah, he went home alone and went to the barracks, his army barracks, and he was by himself playing Beethoven and Mahler, and feeling depressed after the Trinity test success.
All right, Gary.
Hi. So my question is, you seem to be saying that since Truman asked this question in, I guess, 1945, I can't remember, you said it was before the bomb was dropped or after, about this theoretical time in the future where, what they might, dropping 400 bombs, et cetera, would, negate any possibility of the Soviet Union ever getting a nuclear weapon. That means that years later when that happened, that really would have been taken. Was that just a sort of a academic question, or it seems to be a leap to say that actually would have been carried out years later. Such a horrific act. I think that the rest of the world would condemn. Is that the argument that you're making? And I guess one other thing is, I think Mike already kind of hinted at this. I mean, his idea was that he didn't want the bomb to be used, but it seemed like what you were saying is Ted gave more information in between or right around the times that the bombs had already dropped. So it's like basically that justification went out the window. So anyway, I just like you to comment on those two things.
Yeah, well, he felt just what his attitude was after the dropping of the two bombs was that, thank God I did what I did, because it showed that the U.S. had no compunction of bombing, cities and killing, massive numbers of people. But the more so as the true numbers of the bombs, a death toll came out, and the details of how they did it when the maximum number of people were out on the street to maximize the death toll. But the other thing is that these plans were operational plans. These were not war games. All of these plans were premised on the idea that this would be done. And, there might be a pretext. There might be like something that happened that they could use as a justification for you doing it, but the plan was to do it. And it's supported too by the book that came out much, much later and dealt with a slightly later period, even after the Russians had, the ability to retaliate. And that's the one by Ellsberg, the one that's called the Doomsday Bomb, or the Doomsday Plan, Confessions of a Nuclear Planner. I'm trying to remember the title. It's 2018. It was, he published it just before he died. The Doomsday something. Anyway, the Ellsberg makes it clear that he was studying the actual operational plans for U.S. use of nuclear weapons, and he was horrified to find out how low down the chain of command the decision to launch a nuclear war on the Soviet Union was, all through the Cold War. And he was deputized by the Department of Defense secretary to interview base commanders around the world, pilots of individual planes and everything, to find out where did the line stop for someone to make that decision. And he found out it was like as low as you can possibly imagine, because there were always reasons why you had to think, well, what if the communications were down and there was a crisis and the base commander thought that the war had started? Well, then he has to make the decision about whether to launch. It was like amazing stuff. And so I have no doubt that this was what the plan was. And they were talking about, I have in the book quotes from the key people that were making the decisions, that one of them, for example, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had a report that was published right after the Trinity test was successful, in which it was their strategic decision that the U.S. would strike first. And that became the standard for the U.S., and it is to this day.
All right. And what Jim McFadden put in the chat the book that Ellsberg did was The Doomsday Machine
The
Confession
Doomsday Machine, right? Thank
of a
you.
Nuclear Planner. And I just wanted to share with the people here, this is actually the published plans that David was referring to earlier. Garland put them together in 1990. These are all these declassified plans, Reaper, Pincher, Drop Shot, Bushwhacker. They're all published in a 10-volume series that
Yeah,
was
I looked at those in the archives, the National Archives. I looked and we got some pictures of them for the movie.
right. All right. And there's a question that Robert Tender wrote, and this is an interesting question. Did Ted ever think of sabotaging the project to prevent the bomb? Did he
He what?
Did he ever think of sabotaging the project to
No,
prevent
he
the bomb
didn't. He
being
didn't.
developed?
He didn't. And you know, if I had been able to question him, the question that occurred to me is, um, how did he feel in the fact that he had to stay working on it in order to find out how it worked because it hadn't worked yet? And he was designing he was doing the tests to get the implosion design working. And so if he didn't do that, he wouldn't have been able to tell the Soviets about it. So he had to stay on. He couldn't do what Rotblat did, and he had to make it work. And so when the Nagasaki bomb went off, that was his bomb, and which is a horrifying thought. But you know, he felt that he had to get the plan, the finalized working plan, which he didn't really get done and able to hand out until after Hiroshima had happened. Uh, and when his bomb was not, he didn't know, but his bomb was going to be used 3 days later.
Interesting. And I just wanted to show people this is a picture of him at Los Alamos. You're talking about a 19-year-old kid,
18.
18-year-old kid, a brilliant 18-year-old kid. That's his Los Alamos pass that he had. Now go on, Michael.
I would say it is possible that because he wouldn't have sabotaged the bomb at the anything to counter it when he first came on, because again they still didn't know if Germany was going to get the bomb. So he may have seen a need for it at that time. That's one postulation. But I have to ask you a question about fallout. And well, first of all, thank God the Air Force didn't trust Hoover, but in the Air Force, in the military, and among the politicians, I know there was they didn't quite at the outset understand the concept of fallout and prevailing winds and all of these things. So to have used 400, or at least that many, the number that would have gotten through, 400 bombs at one time on the Soviet Union, was anybody thinking about the effects of the fallout? Which by that time, I mean, I know MacArthur didn't think about it when he wanted to use 50 nuclear bombs on China during the Korean War, but MacArthur was what he was. But anyway, was there any thought as to the possibility how it might affect large, huge parts of the rest of the world? Or
Well,
how
they knew they knew about fallout because Ted actually, when the bomb was tested, he was about 20 miles away in a truck that they had posted a whole bunch of trucks and had these SED troops four guys to a truck, and they were supposed to be prepared to race out in what's it, Giorno del Morte valley to mostly native people that lived there and to rescue them and move them if the winds shifted. As it turns out, they did, but they didn't know that even they went further and the fallout hit other places way far away from the test site. And there are people still suing over that. But they did know that the fallout was going to happen and that it would be dangerous to life. And so I'm sure that was true, but obviously that was not a concern if they were trying to destroy the country. I doubt if they thought it would destroy the world. It probably wouldn't have. I mean, 400 bombs of 20 kilotons each is a lot smaller than 1 megaton bomb, than a single one. So, it was a smaller deal, but it would have been a horrible atrocity that you can say.
Right, but it wasn't seen as something that would actually blow back, such as when poison gas blows back against they didn't even think in those terms. The military, politicians.
Right. They probably would have thought the same way that people that were shooting off the poison gas thought, well, most of it's going to land on the targets and, we'll wear gas masks. They probably thought the same way. Well, we'll have some fallout and then we'll, deal with it.
Well, I should add that about 30 years ago, I did several lengthy radio shows that were on this topic, on the dropping of the bomb. And it was done during the 50th anniversary of the Second World War. And I have to say, what amazed me so much, and I had people from all different points of view. I had Al Purovitz on. I had people who disagree with Al Purovitz. I had people in the center. I had people, it was around the time of the Enola Gay controversy of the Smithsonian. And I'll never forget that every night I did it, the light board of the radio station was lit up, 20 people at a time calling up wanting to make a comment about it. Because there were still many people still alive who had experienced the Second World War firsthand. And they had different opinions about dropping a bomb. And it still remains to me one of the most controversial issues that we will debate, because we used the bomb and, we go back and forth on these debates about it. And I think forever we'll be fighting about it. But I wanted to ask if anyone else who hadn't had a comment or time to ask a question, John, Sheridan, or Miles, or Joan, if you wanted to make any comments before, because I see David's voice probably needs some water here. So does anybody else want to have a last shot here? Go on.
Okay, when we had the 1961 crisis in USARA over access to Berlin, we delivered tactical nuclear weapons to some of our units in the field. Now, they weren't going to be the big ones, but we were prepared to do that. And the Russians didn't have a tactical nuclear weapon then. They just had big ones. And they backed down and we got into Berlin.
You're talking about 48 or
61? No, 61.
61.
During Kennedy's administration.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Were those the ones with on the mortars?
Well, yeah. This would have been. We had a nuclear round for an 8-inch howitzer and an honest John missile.
Jeez.
And then we had those little small ones. Yeah. Yeah, and the plan was to do it.
But you know what really is weird? I was looking at the targeting on some of the early war plans, and they were including bombing cities in the Eastern Bloc countries, Warsaw and, these historic cities. They were even going to bomb Dresden. And the funniest one to me was that they had one of the target cities was East Berlin. And I was thinking, wait a minute.
Oh, yeah.
You think you could drop a bomb on East Berlin and not affect West Berlin?
Yeah.
It's like crazy.
Yeah.
Well, and also, yeah, and also, look, we know about the literature on the Korean War. And actually, the radiation issue was something, if one recall, one of MacArthur's genius plans there was to create a radiation corridor across the Yalu River to prevent the LA from coming in. And who knows?
Radioactive cobalt, I think they wanted to do.
Exactly. And there's and again, I haven't reread those war plans in like 20 years. but they're quite a revelation to look at when you think about the issue. And I remember many years ago going to Stanford University when David Holloway just had taken over the Center for Internet. He took over the Russian Studies program, and his book, Stalin the Bomb, I recommend to everybody. It's a very interesting book to read on this whole subject. But Ted, you came in a little late. Too bad. We were just about ready to conclude. But again, is John or Miles or Ted, do you have any question that you'd want to pose to, or Joan, do you want, to Dave before we go?
I'm fine. I won't join. I just want to catch the tail end of it. I had other things going on, so.
Right. Well, yeah, I'm sure.
I'm sorry I missed the beginning.
Right.
Thank you very much for coming to talk to us. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you, Dave, and also Ted. Of course, we perhaps we'll do this another time because Ted, of course, is a specialist in Japanese history, so he would have been really fun to be here. But I want to thank you so much, Dave, for being so generous with your time. I guess you're rewriting this book. Are you doing this book at this point?
Yeah, I'm in Cambridge for the year, academic year with my wife who has a sabbatical here. She's a harpsichordist and forte pianist and a visiting professor in the music department. And so we're in residence here, and I am getting 6 file drawers of Ted's that were found in his bedroom by his 2 daughters when they were cleaning out the house to sell it. So they're down in London. I have to pick up the boxes and go through the files, but it's letters and correspondence and writings and stuff of Ted's. So I may find some good stuff, and I'm allowed to do, since the book sold enough that they're going to let me do a paperback edition. I'm not allowed to like rewrite the text, but they're giving me as many words as I need and pages of an afterword to update anything I get.
Great.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, we once again want to thank you. We've been talking with Dave Lindorff, who is the author of well, he's also the co-producer, is it, of A Compassionate Spy, the film?
Yeah, I was the producer, Mitten is the one that did the organizing of the shoots and, you know, all the mechanics of getting everybody where they needed to be. I found all the people to interview and basically did all the research for my book on my director's fee, because it was producer's fee, because it was all the same issue. I mean, there's no way you can put in a movie all the people that I interviewed for the book, but you have to really select the best people for the movie. But I think we did a good job with it.
Well, it's a great topic, and he's reworking his book, Spy for No Country: The Story of Ted Hall, the teenage atomic spy who may have saved the world. Well, on that note, I want to thank you so much, and really very productive, really quite
Jim.
Listen to what
Thanks for having me.
And we really enjoyed it, and thank you so much. We look forward to talking to you again soon.
Okay, thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much again. I'm sorry I've been late.
Oh, anybody, by the way, anybody who wants to ask me a question can write me at dlindorff@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to answer it.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much. And the name of the book again is, Dave, you want to name the book again? One person wanted to get that.
Yeah, Spy for No Country, the story of Ted Hall, the teenage atomic spy who may have saved the world.
All right. Well, thanks again. You have a great day.